Hey, let's talk about games.
Hello there, my friend, and thank you for taking the time to stop by my tiny little corner of the internet. Today we are going to be doing the first video of my Let's Talk series, and we're going to be talking about Space Hulk Tactics. This will be a critique video of sorts, going through the game in some depth as far as I see it. This will be biased. This will be my personal view on things. If you're making purchasing decisions, please base your decision on multiple sources, not just this. But to kick things off, if you're not familiar with what Space Hulk is, well, firstly, it's obviously covered by the Games Workshop franchise and IP. This was originally a board game that was released way back when in 1989. I think rather curiously, only a couple of years after the first Alien film. And I think it's no coincidence that prior to this, Gene Stealers did not have quite so much fluff and attention, and all of a sudden they became the perfect alpha predator, and hey presto, Space Hulk was born. A bunch of Terminators pitched against a mob, let's say, because it's an indeterminate number of Gene Stealers within a Space Hulk, which is a mishmash of ships clustered together within space, more or less acting as debris floating around. This is the setting of the turn-based, tile-based game, which made the rather popular board game, which had several versions over the years since. Now, fast forward a few years later, and we have a manifestation of this board game via Cyanide Studios. Now, these are the same developers that brought to you Blood Bowl 2, they are bringing to you Call of Cthulhu coming up soon, and Space Hulk Deathwing. So these guys have been fairly busy, and they've also come up with a number of various sports and pro Tour de France simulators, and a lot of various other stuff that I will admit I have not played all of. But here we are, going through Space Hulk Tactics. Now, what is the game? The game itself is a adaptation of the board game with a few changes to the rules and a few additional layers to provide the developers with a means to help balance the game. You may see this as a good or a bad thing. The choice can be entirely yours, but that is their justification for doing so. We will be going over these mechanics in some detail, but for now, what I think we should do is go into the game and have a little look. Now, in the name of and in memory of Total Biscuit, God rest his soul, I'd like to just bring up the options menu, because I think it is fair comment that he was the only person who ever did this. There is adequate compensation or customization here for players that aren't very happy with the in-game UI and workings. There are certain, let's say, camera modes that I personally would insist on changing when first loading up the game. I am not a big fan of certain camera modes. I'm not a big fan of the auto camera. I'm not a big fan of camera follow. It's typically quite distracting, and there are a few other things I would turn off, but let's not go into that. Actually, one, I would insist, if you have this game, change that first person to isometric straight away. Just change it, you will thank me later when we go on to the gameplay. If we take a look at display, you obviously have windowed borderless full screen, very nice to have, the various resolutions, of course, anti-aliasing. We have a slider for all of these, but it works pretty well, and I have to say, resolution, texture, shadow, quality-wise, I think graphically, most people are going to get away with running this quite high. The game runs pretty smoothly. I'm not going to compare rigs and FPS, but if you're playing a game like this for FPS, I'll be slightly confused. It's a turn-based game. I don't think you would really even notice if the frame rate dipped a little bit. There's never a particularly huge amount of units on screen either, so the frame rate stays relatively stable. If we go over to the controls, you will find out that they are, on first appearance, not bindable, but after you actually have a try, they are, which is wonderful. Bindable controls, always a necessity in life, and of course, that is us done. Now, moving on to the meat of this. We have a single-player campaign for both the Terminators and the Gene Stealers, if we go ahead and select here. For the Terminators, you are stuck with the Blood Angels. If you don't like them, I'm afraid all of the audio, all of the in-game portraits, etc. are of the Blood Angel orientation. So that's simply what you're going to be playing. The Gene Stealers themselves are just simply playing Gene Stealers. I have a feeling they are a high fleet in particular, but it's not necessarily hugely significant to the campaign. The actual campaigns themselves operate as a series of skirmishes which will last you some time to work through. Going through this, you unlock a few additional things, such as additional weapon choices for your squad, and additional character choices. There are 5 different types of Terminator. There is not a whopping amount of variety, but that is pretty much just simply canon. And you will unlock new cards. Now, the card system, I think, is a very useful thing to bring up, but we will do so in a moment as it needs a good natter. The campaign itself, if you are there looking at the Steam reviews, you will see some bad, let's say, comments or impressions on the campaign. Now, initially on launch, this game had the wonderful idea of having regular missions and, let's call them, filler missions, which occur every now and again and come out of a random pool of 9 missions, or 9 to 12. And there was no failsafe at the time to prevent you from playing the same one multiple times in a row. So what was happening, if you have 100 people playing this campaign, quite a few of those are going to be playing the same map twice in a row. Even some of those are going to end up playing 3 in a row. It's just inevitable, and it does seem a little bit of an oversight from the developers at launch that there wasn't a fail-safe mechanism to prevent this. Fortunately, the patch that has just dropped has changed this. Now there are 20 of these random maps that can occur as fillers, and there is a way now to guarantee that you won't play the same one twice until you've played them all. So the repetitiveness and those comments regarding playing the same map several times in a row during the campaign should no longer be applicable. So we can scratch that one. Well done to the developers. In truth, it was a very simple fix to make. I mean, in terms of practicality and what it does, I have no idea how much coding it took, but something it was a shame wasn't in the game at launch, as it did certainly attract a fair degree of negative press. Now, when it comes to the story, the voice acting and all of this, it's certainly adequate. But for me, if we're going to show off this game, the Skirmish Mode is the better way to do so because you have everything already unlocked. To go into what is new about this game first, let us bring up one of the 4 chapters. I think actually probably a good time to mention what the 4 chapters are. We have the Blood Angels, the Dark Angels, the Space Wolves, and the Ultramarines. Blood Angels being a fairly sort of jack of all trades, but a little bit more melee focused, but still quite flamey too. Dark Angels a little bit more librarian-ish, Space Wolves a little bit more melee-ish, and Ultramarines obviously slightly overpowered. Just joking, they have more squad-orientated stuff. Let's say for now we'll go into more details. When you load up a squad, we get our first peep at the actual units and, let's say, visual manifestation of Warhammer 40,000 Terminators. And I have to say, Cyanide, I feel, have done a pretty decent job, although I also think it's quite hard to do a bad job these days, as Games Workshop pretty much give you an exact instruction as to what to make, how to make it, and how it should look. But nevertheless, texture-wise, I think fairly attractive. The units look pretty good, and as you can see, you have an array of weapon choices. We'll come back to aesthetics in just a moment, as there's a lot more to say. Weapon choices for each of the characters are very relevant, and this is thanks to Cyanide Studios' extra development choice here of having cards. Now, what happens when you have 5 Terminators is each of their 4 cards will be placed into a ginormous deck, and this deck you will get 3 cards of at the beginning, and you can do things with this deck. You have to use certain CP, which is a combat point you accumulate over the turns to play them, but you can also convert them to give you extra action points, which are your action economy. So this basically provided the developers with an extra layer of depth to the game and an extra way to influence balance. And I think that's the best way to say it, because some people would certainly argue that it's influenced balance in a way they like, and others may have a feeling that actually it's detracted from the actual original board game and that the cards maybe are a little bit unbalanced. But one of the other advantages is that each of the factions will have different cards available to them. So each of the factions, when I say factions, I mean chapters of the Terminators, will potentially have different deck compositions that they can come up with. Each Each of the characters too will have some of their own special rules. You can do this simply by scrolling up and down. The apothecary, for example, when someone dies in front of him, you roll a d6. This game works entirely on d6, and that will do some wonderful stuff. And if you roll a 4+, you will resurrect them, which is kind of cool, but also means that someone has to die in order for it to have a chance to work. So a potential backup plan for a melee perhaps, but something I wouldn't want to rely on too much. Now, while we're here, one thing I would like to do is show you the visual customization before we go into any more detail regarding the game. We'll go into the detail of the aesthetics. Now, you can see a tiny visual change here on the helmet, not particularly visible, but if we go over to the chest piece, you can start playing around with some pretty crazy combinations. And the actual level of choice and customization here is nothing short of impressive. You can change the global color from one to another, as well as the dirt and this, that, and the other, and the grime, the scratches. But what is far more enjoyable to do is to change things individually. We could change his right pauldron to being black, black and black, and there you go, you have a black pauldron. You have various different options to make this more exciting. If we go over to here, what we shall do now is go to the pattern, and if we hover over now, we can go, say, there, and we can, there you go, create an Easter egg within the game. A literal Easter egg Terminator containing all them goodies inside. A little late for Easter, but never mind. There are some potentially wonderful combinations within this game, and I would say that it is a feature that I found to be very, very rewarding thus far. Something I've really enjoyed coming up with my own squads and manifestations. If I bring up something I made earlier, here we go. A bunch of, well, technically blood angels, but I don't even know what to call them. I don't really care. But this is something for me that is hugely important to the 40k fan. When you have something on a table, especially when it's a single squad, you want to feel like you created something. And here we go. A chapter that I have created, or a sub-chapter of the blood angels. I don't really care about the canon. I just care that they look awesome. So this, I feel, is a good start to the game. Visual customization was something nice to have. You have all of this visual customization from the word get-go. There is a pre-order bonus of one of the extra color choices. We won't go into the discussion of is that a good or a bad thing, but that is, hey presto, your choices. I feel it would only be fair as well to bring up the actual Gene Stealers. We have 4 high fleets to pick from. This generally influences colour scheme, it doesn't influence cards, and you have 5 in total Gene Stealer units to assemble into a squad. Now, you don't spawn with these 5 units like the Terminators do, but these are potential units you can have, and they will influence your deck. So you have the Reap effects, the Miasmic, the Bulwark, a Broodlord, and a standard Gene Stealer. Each of these cards can be played, and you can obviously hover over and check out the different units. You don't have to have a Broodlord. You can have pretty much any combination here that you like, but I believe you are limited to how many Broodlords you have. I could be wrong there. You are certainly, for the Terminators, limited slightly in squad composition to only 1 Sergeant, only 1 Apothecary, and only 1 Librarian. I feel that is reasonable, and generally speaking, you wouldn't really want to go over that limit. Now, when it comes to customization, there is another level of the game that we need to just briefly address, and this is the map creator, which is a good way to display some of the actual game's visuals. We'll load it up here. It is pretty much as simple as placing cardboard tiles on a table in front of you. It does a fairly nice job of automatically snapping things where you like. You can right click, left click, and do a combination of clicks, zoom in, zoom out, and basically place whatever the hell you like in any combination you like. There is not particularly not a lot of limits, and well, it works. That's all I can say. I haven't had any bugs or issues. You can obviously very clear highlighted red tiles where things overlap and don't work correctly. It works in a satisfactory manner. It sometimes takes a little bit of time to piece everything together perfectly, but you can certainly come up with some rather glorious looking maps. You can go ahead and place objectives on these mission parameters, but let's just take a simple look at the map itself after just switching some of the tiles around for various other types. And we can, of course, then zoom in via the tab key. Now we are inside the ship. There we go. Purity seals on the wall, and we can have a little snoop around. I have to say, the graphic styling of the game is something that I'd be very, very happy playing an FPS shooter in. It would certainly feel like an FPS shooter from about, I don't know, 5 to 10 years ago, but it still looks very nice. Textures, very, very nice. Adequate detail, really, considering this is a top-down game. This is not a game where you are designed to be doing this. Or is it? We're going to be coming back to that in a moment. Also worth mentioning that there is an Orc ship as well as an Eldar ship, and you can change these tiles for the other skins at a whim. We won't be going through all of them though, because that would take quite some bloody time. So, I think it's time to actually talk about the gameplay itself. If we go here for a skirmish, we will go for a custom match against an AI. Now, what we'll do, we have 9 missions available thus far that the developers have created, and there are, of course, other missions that have been created by players, but let's start with the official. And I tell you what, let's go for an Orc ship because it's one of my damn favourites. Let's go for... Lovely. It's a nice looking ship. We'll go, of course, for my custom looking squad because they look awesome, and we'll go for no turn timer because we're going to need a little bit of time to talk about this. So, thus far you might be thinking, well, Hydra, there is a campaign that is, or was, fairly, let's say, mixed reviews regarding, but that maybe has been fixed in terms of repetitiveness now. There's not a lot of RPG features to it in terms of unlocking stuff for your units. I feel that's fair criticism, but I would say if they're making a manifestation of the board game, then it really shouldn't be too much of a surprise using a D6 system that you don't have a whopping amount of unlocks for your character. This isn't an FPS that's based on some arbitrary values where a weapon does 12 damage. Everything's based on the D6 rule system, so I really feel if you go mucking around with probabilities and small percentages and making units stronger as you play through, you're getting into very dangerous territory. The actual rewards of giving players extra cards as you go through, I think, is about as much as I could expect from a game that, again, is a manifestation of the tabletop game rather than created from arbitrary numbers. If they went for a D100 system in this and made a completely new rule set, I'd say, yeah, maybe you could give them more pieces of gear to equip on each Terminator, a bit like Deathwing, but with loads of different units. Again, though, I don't think that's what was aimed for, and therefore it's not what I personally expected. Now we are in the game. Let us first talk about the UI as it has come up. The UI for me is adequate, although quite often to begin with it can be a little bit scary. Now this is actually in its more minimal form. If we skip to the next go, we will unveil the whole of the UI and get access to our squad's UI. There are a few terms that will take a few moments to get used to, and sometimes the hotkeys for trying to move between actions can feel a little bit cumbersome. I have pressed the wrong button once or twice, skip turns when I didn't want to, and all of a sudden you find out you've missed an entire turn, but it's really just a case of getting the hang of it. We have CP up there, command points, we have squad points here, and then we have action points for the actual character. Action points being your action economy. Once you've run out of action points, you can dip into your squad action points to run further. So if we go ahead and pull up a card, what we can do here now, take advantage of the card mechanic, is you can either play this card using one of my command points or sell this card or convert it into extra action points. So if I press the number 2 here, this has now been converted, giving me 2 squad AP. If I select this character, I could move forward using my 4 action points. It does take an action point to turn, always worth noting. And I could even dip in and move further. The reason I can't go right the way forward there is a blooming door in the way. Now, before we go ahead and move him, I think it's worth venturing into the wonderful mechanic that is the first-person view. Now, I say wonderful mechanic, it is, let's be honest, a little bit gimmicky. I have tried to play several rounds in this view, and it is not particularly efficient. It is borderline a little bit of a headache. It is possible to get a better view if we go forward here by pressing the X key. Now I can see through walls and see exactly what is where, and you could even have a go at counting tiles, although for the life of me it's just a lot quicker just to press the button and have a look. Tactical view is of some use if there are locked doors and things of the sort. You press the X key and you can see which door is linked with what. I think this is a very nice way of showing an objective view. but it is something that perhaps doesn't quite compensate for how difficult and clunky the first-person view is, although, again, it does look quite nice, and you can even do combat actions in it using the hotkeys. Here is where we come to one of the game's drawbacks. As you will notice, each one of my units is moving one at a time. They cannot act together. This is something that has been met with some criticism, because one of the largest criticisms of this game, other than the repetitiveness of the map issue of campaign, is that the actual skirmishes, if you have two players of an equal decision-making sort of capability, let's say, I don't want to say skill, but there is quite a lot of decision making in this game, and bad decisions will end a game very quickly. If you have a very cautious Terminator who is playing very, very well, you will have a game that may go on for an entire bloody hour, perhaps longer, but roughly around 45 minutes to an hour is not uncommon. This can be incredibly slow. It can become perhaps a little bit on the tedious side if you are finding games, well, if you simply prefer games to be a bit quicker. It could be a deal breaker for you. I think it's a very, very reasonable point that some people will simply not want to invest a whole hour in trying to play through a mission of a game. We're of the era in 2018 where many people like playing games on a semi-casual basis. We like to log in the evening for a couple of hours. And if you're going to be playing for an hour just to try and finish a skirmish, it's a potential issue. So many people have asked for a way in order to make the game smoother. Here is where things become a little bit complicated, I feel. Having simultaneous movement would, yes, speed things up by allowing them to move faster. It would also come with the price of potentially making players make a lot more mistakes. This is a game where having a one click of the button on one tile instead of another, tile A instead of tile B, can be the difference between winning or losing. So it's very, very easy to fuck up, especially as a Terminator. You only have 5 of them. The Gene Stealers, however, continually spawn through these various points. They reveal themselves via blips, and then they run at you to try and eat you. It's up to the Gene Stealer to choose where they want to spawn these blips, and the blips will reveal themselves as they come into field of view, or you can reveal them manually. You can also convert them using your cards into more specialist units. This is a separate mechanic for the Gene Stealers only, and this is why they have both a spawning phase and a conversion phase. Now, I think now is a very good time to start looking at the combat and discussing the differences between the two factions. If we jump into first person here, when we aim at a unit, you will notice not only my screen vibrating like I'm stood on top of a Nokia 3210, but only a 31% chance of killing the bugger. Now, for some people, this will be a very surprising number. A lot of people I have seen make comments saying, why is it so hard to kill a Gene Stealer using a Stormbolter? Aren't I supposed to be the Emperor's finest? I think it's a fair counter-argument. They're supposed to also be an amazingly nimble predator capable of dodging stuff. But nevertheless, 31% is what you've got action to. So me, I have a fortunate buff in that when you shoot a second time, you actually have a small bonus with this weapon. Now, what you may have noticed then, neither of those shots were towards him. And this is perhaps my first piece of, let's say, clumsy feedback for the game, because there was actually a spawn pod here. And if I'm looking at this unit and I press 1, it didn't do this. It actually zoomed in and aimed at the spawn pod because it was closer. And this is something that sometimes can get a little frustrating if you try and do these actions quickly. If I were to select him, press 1 click, now it works, but if I'd done the same thing beforehand, it would have shot the pod. Basically, I've wasted 2 action points by shooting this green fog, and that has not really done anything for me. However, we also have a little bit of praise coming in here, because the action camera sequence, as you've just noticed, is pretty damn glorious. It is, well, dare I say, a little bit beautiful, and it's something that I feel deserves a little bit of praise. This is perhaps one of the other arguments that simultaneous movement may not be appropriate, because moments like this, if you're moving 5 units at once, all of a sudden may be confusing as heck. Now, we get to see our flamer. providing a little bit of area control and a very high probability of killing an enemy. It will only survive on a roll of a 1, like that guy has done. Fortunately, every time he moves to another tile, which is on fire, you have to roll that D6 again. Now, if you're wondering around this D6 system, if you press the T key, you can actually cycle through and look at what was rolled. This is something I was oblivious to as a player, and I feel should be mandatory. Simply because knowing what has actually happened, what cards the enemy has played, and when you hover over a unit to see exactly what buffs they have. There we go. We can now see in the top right we have move and shoot on and veteran, meaning +1 in frontal melee. Information like that, incredibly useful to the player. Took me about 3 days to find it. Maybe I was just being thick. So, animations, visuals, all looking very good. Strategy, gameplay-wise, this is where it starts to become slightly more complex. The two different factions have very different playstyles. One is playing more of a survival game, and the other is playing a little bit of a horde management game. The Terminators have to think and plan every move with the utmost precision, and you could certainly argue that doing so with the Gene Stealers is going to help them a lot, but it is also very fair comment that Gene Stealers have more opportunities to fuck up. Therefore, I believe that is one of the main reasons that you will see a large win-loss discrepancy between the two factions. And why, at the same time, we have crashed. No, we haven't. Now, a rather fortunate piece of timing there. We've just had our first crash, and speaking honestly, that is the first time this has crashed on me in quite some time, perhaps a byproduct of the new patch, but a good opportunity to show off the Gene Stealers and continue our discussion about the actual in-game balancing. You will see many discussions, and I feel for this entire game's future, you will see continual discussions about the game's balance. One faction being too strong, something being too weak, one being overpowered, underpowered, etc. And the difficulty is that this game is asymmetric. You have two different playstyles going on simultaneously. You have the Terminators with their 5 precious units who really can't afford to die or fuck up, and the Gene Stealers that, of course, making clever decisions and witty combat maneuvers is very, very important, but you can lose a unit without feeling quite so punished. You can even throw units at an enemy if you feel you have a statistical enough advantage to slowly overcome them. If you have a 1 tile of Overwatch between you and you have 1 unit to attack them with, it's safe to say it's more than worth attacking them. This is where the game really becomes somewhat complicated because it is going to be very, very easy for a player to pick up the Gene Stealers compared to the Terminators. I would say I lost my first maybe 8 turns or 8 games as a Terminator, and that was a little bit frustrating and disheartening. Eventually I figured out my arse from my elbow, but that was after some amount of frustration and whimpering. This is something that maybe I was slower than average, but I do feel even the most studious of players will find, especially when engaging in PvP, that Terminators are simply more punishing to play. However, there is also the counter-argument that when played, quote, correctly, Terminators are insanely powerful, and it is very hard for a Gene Stealer to achieve victory. Because of that, there is a massive skill discrepancy within this game, and it can be, I believe, both one of the good things for this game and the bad. One of the good things is that it gives you something to practice and learn. The reward of this game really is the craft of this game as I see it. It's a bit like playing something like chess. You don't play it because you want to unlock a bigger sword that does more damage on a scale of 1 to 100. You do it because next time you play it, you want to make all of those decisions perfectly. I think that is where the potential joy of this game comes from. If you like having those Skinner box rewards of an ARPG, this is not going to scratch those itches at all. It does not provide you a small amount of progression for every single mission you complete. It does not give you experience. It does not give you currency. It does not give you bells and whistles the more you play. It simply allows you to learn and absorb the game. That, I think, is not necessarily a bad decision. I don't necessarily think it's a good decision. It is just a decision which will have its impact. Some people will probably love it, some people will not. I think it goes without saying that Skinner boxing is definitely an easy way to rope people into games, but here we are with what we've got. And I would say what they've got at least feels quite genuine to the board game, and I do feel going into any of these Skinner box mechanics would probably be somewhat disingenuous to it. So, here we are with a nice example of a tactical situation. The enemy is on Overwatch. Each one of these tiles gives them an opportunity to shoot me when I walk over it. Now here I don't have access to how many squad points he has. For every jam he gets, which can occur when firing on Overwatch, there is a possibility that if he doesn't have enough squad points to assist him in reloading, that he will jam indefinitely and I can run towards him to bite his bum. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a good crack at that by shifting to the next phase. So we shift to the next phase, which allows us to move. We open the door and we spawn a Gene Stealer. The reason you reveal blips here is some, like this one here, will be a fake. Some will not. Some will have 3 units, some will have 1. And this provides a interesting point of balance, as well as an interesting way to simply employ some tactics and surprise elements to the game. Some of these blips will be dummies, people will use expensive ammunition in order to try and kill them, and it's all very well and wonderful. What you'll notice is I have a very high quantity of tiles between me and him, and fortunately he eventually jammed. Now we come to the melee portion of the game. Melee is something as a Gene Stealer you're going to thrive at. When it comes to the D6 system, you roll 3d6 and he rolls 1. This is why you have a 66% chance of winning and jumping on his face to bite his bum. Now this was a very classic example of me having access to enough units to risk such a strategy. I've killed a unit, yes, I've sacrificed quite a lot in doing so. Was it worth it? Only time will tell, but this is something you can do with the Gene Stealers without being overtly punished. The issue is, though, if I were to do this with the Terminators, well, it's only a matter of time before you lose. So, this being said, again, just coming back to the central point here, I think that there is certainly some room for discussion regarding balance, and it's going to be very, very tricky for the developers to achieve. But I do think the game is probably in a better situation than the board game, because at least they have the card system as a way to provide extra input to the balance, as well as variety to the chapters. Chapters having different cards, again, means that when you're bored of one chapter, you have another one to try and to test out. Yet again, I think now is a perfect demonstration of this being just a little bit too slow. Even if playing against AI, I have to say I don't know of an obvious solution to this. The movement is very, very slow and deliberate. You could perhaps make argument it could be sped up. There is, of course, then running the risk of it being disingenuous to the actual IP. Terminator doesn't fly around the map doing backflips. We all know what people think of games which incorporate that. But at the same time, it is a potential issue that this game is so damn slow. And I would actually like to correct myself here. I had stated that you cannot save. If I press the simple escape button here, you can save games against opponents. That is worth noting, and I apologise for getting that wrong. Unfortunately, failed on the last tile. Let us see if we have another little bit of luck here. With only a 1 in 3 chance of hitting, it's actually fairly easy to get through 2, sometimes even 3 tiles if you have enough Gene Stealers at your disposal. The cards for the Gene Stealers also worth considering. You can play certain ones of these to get massive bonuses, like this, giving me an extra 6 cards. Of course, I can't play them all at once because they cost MP for these guys instead of CP, instead of command points. Are they monster points? I can't even remember. MPs, we'll just call them, members of parliament. And of course, each one of these cards does something different. There's some pretty interesting tactics too. Some will be described as slightly overpowered. This miasmic one in particular allows us to place a bit of rubble on the map at a tile of our choosing, and this can be used to not only block off movement, but also, in theory, blocking off Overwatch. You will certainly see some complaints about this tile, as it can catch people off guard if they're not expecting it. Again, I feel a potential downside of the game, in that you may think everything is going well, and all of a sudden it is not. That is an inevitable thing within a game that includes such levels of decision making, but it is again a potential, not even drawback, but a potential thing that may alienate some customers. The amount of games where I thought I was doing pretty well, didn't appreciate that a certain someone had a certain card, and all of a sudden my entire squad was dead. That's actually happened quite a lot, and I think that's something players will need to be prepared for mentally when they embark into this game. It is something that can happen, and it is something that you should even expect every now and again. I think now a very good time to show off the rubble. Obviously I don't have anything particularly useful to place it on, but... Oh, it's opponent's turn. There you go. A classic example of me thinking I hadn't moved to the next phase, tapping the enter button again and fucking up. That is perhaps my one gripe with the UI. It is very, very easy to do that. I've done it numerous times. Many people have suggested me just use a mouse to click in the bottom right, but I really think that enter should not be serving multiple purposes, or a double tap should be needed to end your turn. The amount of times that has happened is probably only 1 in 3 games, but missing out on an entire turn is normally enough to make you feel, especially in a PvP, that you should just return to the desktop and go have yourself a coffee and give up for the day. It can be quite infuriating. Now, is there anything else that needs to be discussed? AI, potentially. The AI has just had a very big change. You will see many comments within the Steam forum as well discussing the AI of this game being too passive as gene stealers, being abusable just by going into Overwatch. Well, that was certainly true a couple of weeks ago. What would happen in these situations if a gene stealer was stood here? The gene stealer would think to itself, right, it's a 1 in 3 chance to die, 1 in 3, 1 in 3, 1 in 3, 1 in 3, and I'm probably not going to live through that. Now, the Gene Stealer has had some tweaks in the latest patch, and this should have been changed. So those of you that were finding the actual missions to be a little bit boring and repetitive, that will change. Or rather, that has already changed, and that's something I look forward to checking out. It's hard to say exactly where the sweet spot will be, but the Gene Stealers themselves now will take advantage when they have a numbers advantage, and will also take advantage when the enemy doesn't have the ability to overcome the reload system, or the jam system. So if you have 5 Gene Stealers and someone is low on ammo or something like that, they will now take some risks and run toward you. This is nice to see, and I again think it's something that really should have been picked up during the earlier beta-ish phases. It really just is a little bit surprising that that one slipped under the radar, because it's really should have been quite obvious within beta testing, I think. But in the first major content patch of this game, it has been addressed, and that I think is something we can be somewhat grateful for. Or maybe not grateful for even. It should have been there in the first place, but it's there now. That is nice to see that the corrections have been made. In terms of AI now, we shall simply have to wait and see, but you may find many of those Steam comments going way back to no longer be applicable if the enemy is now being a little bit more aggressive. There was certainly some issues with the Terminator AI as well. We shall have to see how they have been impacted, but they have also had various improvements. Unfortunately, another one bites the dust. Now, in terms of anything else to discuss, I think that is majority of it, aside from the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room for me, the really big key point for this game is that PvP is simply, as I see it, far superior to anything else. This is not because I'm a PvP elitist. This is not because I have some addiction to PvP. This is simply because PvP offers you a less predictable scenario than AI does. But here is the problem. As you will see when you search for a game and read reviews, a lot of people will remind you that there are not a whopping amount of people playing this game at any given time. And in a game which has its primary purpose, I would say, or maybe not primary purpose, but primary enjoyment to come from PvP, that is an issue. Although personally, and this is very difficult for me to comment, because typically when I PvP in this, I stream. And when I stream, people are quite happy to come along and try and kill me. The issue I've heard from many friends, however, is that they have spent countless hours in matchmaking, and that has been immensely frustrating. Oh, he died on the last tile. For real. You see, eventually he rolled the 6 there. God damn it, that was close. This is the big problem for the game right now. The problem is, perhaps this is just due to the niche nature of the game. This is like saying who wants to play a highly thought-provoking strategic game that takes ages to play around and takes ages to find a game. I think the mere probabilities of that all happening at once within a 40k setting means that there's just not going to be that many people instantly playing it. And this is a bit of an issue because the longer the queues, the less people want to play. The less people want to play, the longer the queues. And I think we're already locked into a little bit of a cycle of there not being enough people to get reliable games. I would therefore say, keep an eye on the player base numbers if you are looking to buy this for PvP, and consider, if you have a friend to play against, I think that this would definitely scratch that itch, especially if the two of you enjoy having, or even played the game previously. If you previously played the board game, I think picking this up makes a lot of sense. You could potentially have a whole lot of fun by doing so. But if you're picking this up because you want to spend a couple of hours every evening looking for a game, I think realistically you've got to anticipate that you're going to be spending a large portion of your time looking for games rather than playing them. For some people, that will make or break it, and this is a situation that will potentially change for better or worse over time, so I would really suggest you keep your eyes on the player base number. Thus far, with a player base of about 500, it is not that easy to get a game. Many people, I've been told, have waited for half an hour plus, although again, queue timers are subject to change, and do not quote this number. It will really depend on things at the time. Now, in summary, the game for me is a very beautiful, well-crafted game which has some nice looking mechanics, some interesting features, and some nice things to make what is potentially a very boring top-down game a lot more strategic and interesting. It has not only visually aesthetic item choices and decision choices, it also has gameplay choices which make the board game feel like it's actually been expanded upon. It definitely feels like it's been brought back up to what I would say modern standards. But again, you have to remember that this also simply has a bit of a cost at the moment, that the game is very slow to play. There is no current fix, although it is something the developers have said they are currently working on ideas to work through. But we have seen some improvements made with the game thus far. Overall, I have played a good 20 to 30 rounds of PvP on stream, and I would say, do consider that's more like 20 to 30 hours. That's quite a lot. I have enjoyed it. I have really enjoyed the tension within the game, and I feel that the action cameras, the slow pace is something that actually really works for me. But I would say that this is something that you really need to take a look at and have a think, is this something I can invest into? This is not an action-orientated game. This is the real, true meaning of the word tactical and strategic, to the point it can become frustrating that a small click, a miscalculation at any given time can be the difference between a win or a loss. That's something you need to be accepting when you go into this game. This is not something that you spam buttons and wait to win and watch flashy animations. This is not a chill out. This is use your head. This is calculate. This is predict. This is anticipate. This is something that may or may not appeal. Guys, you've been listening to Hydra, and I would love to know your thoughts, not only on this game, but on this video. I would like to do a video like this on pretty much every 40k game I have, as well as a host of others. If you want to critique my critique of the game, if you think I've been overly Unfair, if you think I have been overly generous toward the game, I would love to hear your thoughts down below in the comments. Guys, you have yourself a great week. I'll see you soon. Take care.